Hey class, this is Mr. Stewart, the criminal justice and security instructor here at Calhoun Community College, and this is going to be the first of a series of brief instructional videos that go along with the content in your CRJ 171 Security Risk Management course. I'm going to try to keep these pretty short and kind of hit some high points and some things that I want you to consider. But I also want you to understand that you do need to play these videos and you need to listen to what I'm saying and draw the parallels within the textbook on these kind of mini lectures on a weekly basis. That will help you get more out of the course and more out of the text, and I'll try to explain some things a little bit better than maybe the textbook explains them. For Chapter 1 is entitled Data-Driven Security, and I want you to understand that almost anything in the business world today is data-driven. And what that means is we use data from previous experiences, previous experiments, results, in order to basically try to come up with a better plan for the future so we don't make the same mistakes. In your textbook, there is a diagram on page 1 of Chapter 1, and it is called the Risk Assessment Process Diagram. That's pretty important that you look at that. You're going to see this diagram in almost every chapter of the text in some shape, form, or fashion. But what it really does is it kind of gives you a little bit of a flow chart as to how we go about determining the risk assessment process. And we're going to talk about risk assessment a little bit later, but we have to understand this whole idea of data-driven security first. And probably one of the key things to remember, and this is also part of your discussion posting for this week, is in regard to data-driven security, what cannot be measured cannot be managed. Now, that's pretty important. I've asked you all to give me your opinion of what you think that means, and I'm going to give you my opinion as well. But you have to understand that if you rely on what we call anecdotal data, which is just what people say and what people think and what their own experience is without any real hard numerical statistical data, it's hard to draw some conclusions on anecdotal data because we're human. We all have a different feeling about something. There's so many variables in play that make us who we are that we can't necessarily just go with what we call anecdotal data and experiential data in order to help us not make some of the same mistakes that we've made in the past. And that's not necessarily just with security, but it's also in the business world in general. This whole idea of what cannot be measured, cannot be managed, is a commonly accepted business paradigm. And what that means is most businesses work off of the bottom line. You know, just take for instance, if you are let's say you have a Subway restaurant, and yes, you can go out and you can make sandwiches, you can sell sandwiches, you can pay your people, but if you're not paying attention to how many loaves of bread you're making today, how many you're throwing away, what your percentage of waste is, what your labor cost is, you can't really get an accurate idea of exactly how much profit you're going to make. And that's a problem that many businesses have, is they don't look at the data in order to determine where their profit margin is. If you do measure and you look at the data that you have and you kind of compute those statistics, you can see, okay, my labor cost is sky high, I need to get rid of somebody. Or my waste cost is too high, I need to reduce waste. It will all affect that bottom line, and that will cause you to have more profit. Now understand that in the security industry, it still is about profit, because you've got a company who wants their business, their information, their people secured for the lowest cost possible. And they don't want the security portion of their business to be the black hole where all of their profit goes into. They want it to be secure, but they want it to be done as cheaply as possible. And so that's why we have contract security companies that are trying to offer this service as cheaply as possible. So the contract security service also needs to understand how to collect and process and measure the data so that they can still make a profit. So data-driven security uses measurable factors to drive a security program. Measurable factors are those things that we can look at, we can decide, does this work? And if it does work, how well does it work? And we put it to the numbers, so to speak, so that we can make a determination as to whether or not this is a profitable program, or we're losing money on this, or this thing is hemorrhaging money, or we're making a good profit, or we're getting the job done and we're doing it well. And it's not necessarily just about how much profit we're making, but it's about providing the service required as cheaply as possible. On page 2 in your textbook, make sure that you read the as is, that's the American Society for Industrial Security guidelines in italics for the role of the chief security officer for any particular company. Many people argue that security is more of an art than a science, and I'm not going to necessarily negate that argument because it is correct. But the business of security is definitely more of a science. It's about getting data, processing that data, determining what that data means, and how can we use this data to improve either our services or improve, again, the company's bottom line. So how do we go about doing that? Well, one of the ways that we go about doing that is we use something called security metrics. And a metric is simply a fancy way of saying this is an operation or a table or a spreadsheet that we can put data in, and it gives us some numbers out on the back end that helps us understand how good of a job we're doing. What they do is they communicate vital information about security activities, and they help us to drive our decision making. So security metrics are important. Almost every major security company and any major corporation that provides security in some shape, form, or fashion probably uses some sort of a metric. Metrics also identify risk based upon previous failures or successes within security procedures or actions. Now that's important because you can try a lot of things in security in order to try to improve the overall security of your company, your agency, or whatnot. But at some point, you have to evaluate how well that's working. Is it working? Is it not working? If it is working, how well? If it's not working, how bad is it not working? So that you can make adjustments to it. You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. That's actually the definition of insanity. So you have to look at the information that you have, process that, see what works, what doesn't, and that will help you make adjustments to that security program, to your security procedures, etc. So metrics can help us determine are company assets being protected? Are we effectively protecting our company assets? If so, that's good stuff. If not, we have some improvements to make. It can also tell us which assets need more protection. Can asset protection be improved? And when I'm using the word asset, I'm actually talking about anything that security is protecting. It's considered a company asset. If it's worth something to the company, it is considered an asset. And that could be a physical object. It could be an idea. It could be if you're Kentucky Fried Chicken, it's the Colonel's secret recipe. That's an asset. You don't want somebody to steal that. If you work for Coca-Cola, you don't want the recipe for Classic Coke to be stolen. You're trying to protect that. Security metrics can also tell us what resources need to be allocated to security. How does our company compare to other companies? You can use it to draw those parallels to see, are we doing as good a job as this other company who's providing security for someone else? You know, if we're not doing as good a job, then we need to fix that. If we're doing a good job, then hey, we can maybe get their contract next time. And one of the major things that security metrics can help us do is to determine whether or not we are reducing liability. And that's a big issue in security, is reducing liability, because if you can reduce the liability, you're actually either getting rid of the risk, or you're transferring some of the risk of doing business to someone else. And you are also reducing the likelihood that a loss is going to be caused to that particular company because of some issue with security. So security metrics can be defined as tools designed to facilitate decision making and improve performance and accountability through collection, analysis, and reporting of relevant data. That's kind of a fancy clinical way of saying it's simply a tool, a process that we use to see how good a job we're doing. Are we doing what we said we could do? And if we are we doing it really good, kind of good, just barely getting by, or are we just failing at it? So for metrics to be accurate, they must have two elements. The first one of those is proper performance data for specific countermeasures under evaluation. And that's another fancy way of saying we got to look at what we're doing to keep things from happening. And we should have data. A good way to think about that would be, okay, let's say you work for a company and they've had a rash of stolen toilet paper rolls because you had standard toilet paper dispensers in the bathroom stalls. So you know that's causing a loss. You're thinking, well, toilet paper, okay, it's 50 cents a roll, maybe 30 cents a roll. If you're having 5,000 rolls of it stolen a year in a major company, and interestingly enough, I don't know why anybody would want to steal corporate toilet paper. It's usually not very good. It's kind of John Wayne-ish. But either way, what you're seeing is a loss. So let's say you have X amount of dollars that are just going down the drain every year because of this particular loss of one of your assets. Now you know that if it's being used, then that's one thing. But if it's simply being stolen and carted out in somebody's lunchbox or cooler or just in their hand because they're too cheap to go to the dollar store and buy their own toilet paper, then that's causing a loss. So what can you do? You spend some money. You buy some toilet paper dispensers so that they can't get the roll out. And so at least the toilet paper that's being used is now being dispensed, and if it's going anywhere, it's either going in the trash or it's going down the toilet. So you spend some money to increase a level of security, and you are decreasing a level of loss. So by understanding how well that works, you need to see how many rolls of toilet paper you were going through a year prior to the installation of those dispensers versus how many rolls of toilet paper are you going through in a period of time after the installation of those dispensers. And that should give you that data that tells you whether or not, hey, what I've done is working. And you also have to have an appropriate baseline from which to compare. And that's also what I just included in that example, is that you got to know what your level of loss was prior so that you know what your level of savings or more loss is after you have initiated some security procedure. If you look on page 6 in your textbook, it talks about SMART metrics, and SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely. And that's the way a metric should be, is they should be specific in what they're addressing. They should be measurable, which means you should be able to look at a before and after numerical scenario to determine whether or not what you're doing is working. It should be actionable, which means it should have some action associated with it, something that you're doing. It should be relevant to your security program, your security procedures, and it should be timely. It should have an expiration date. You don't want a metric to be open-ended. You want to say, I'm going to look at it now during this time period, I'm going to look at it during that time period, and then we're going to crunch those numbers and see whether or not this actually works. So SMART, specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely, are the factors associated with developing what we call a security a security metric. Also on page 6 there are several steps, 7 steps that basically will help you develop a security metric, and these are not set in stone. These are things that you can definitely use, modify. Some of them you may not include, but it's 7 general steps for developing a security metric in your own particular security agency. Going to switch gears here for just a second, and we're going to talk about assessments for a moment. Now, assessments are what you do after you have developed a security metric and you've put that security metric to use. You are assessing how well that metric is actually measuring what you want it to measure. And it also helps you to evaluate your program too. So data-driven assessments can help us to determine the threat, or what threats exist in your particular company or agency. So a threat is basically anything that can go wrong. A threat is somebody steals a roll of toilet paper. A threat is somebody steals your secret KFC recipe. A threat is somebody who doesn't work in the building walks into a secure area of the building. Those are all considered a threat. It's anything that can go wrong, that shouldn't be happening the way it's happening. Somebody getting hurt at work is a threat, because then you're going to have a loss of labor. You're going to have a loss of cost in order for workers' comp to pay for whatever medical care they have to have in regard to the injury. And you may have a loss because of liability if there was something wrong with your machine or with the process or with the procedure that person was engaging in when they got hurt. It might be your fault. You may have to pay for that in a civil lawsuit. So data-driven assessments help us to determine threats. They help us to determine vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are things that make the facility more prone to attack by the threat. And they also help us to understand risk. And risk is basically the combination of the threat and the vulnerability. You look at how likely the threat is and how vulnerable you are to being affected by the threat. And there are 2 ways of doing assessment. One is called quantitative assessment, and this type of assessment is metric based. It's where we actually use numerical statistics. We calculate profit, loss, effectiveness. We do what we call program evaluation using quantitative assessment. And then the other type of assessment is qualitative assessment. And this is for if you don't have the statistics, if you don't have the numbers, this is kind of the thing that you do when doing something is better than doing nothing. Qualitative assessment is always kind of the second place. It's plays second fiddle to quantitative, because qualitative is just not as good. It's like using that anecdotal data, that experiential data from people. But it's okay to use it if you don't have the numbers, until you can get the numbers and do a quantitative assessment. Both qualitative and quantitative assessment lead to good risk assessment. But most people put that quantitative on a much higher plane than the qualitative, because you can't really argue with numbers. The numbers are what they are. It shows what it shows, and it will either show you're doing good, you're doing bad, or you're doing somewhere in between. Qualitative data is really nothing more than providing an opinion based on a few people's experiences. It's really what qualitative is. Now, it can help you understand something a lot better than numbers can. And you may want to use both. You may want to use qualitative prior to you devising a metric in order to get the quantitative. But it can help you understand, maybe what problem with employees or something. I'll give you a brief example. There was a company several years ago a friend of mine was working for. He got called in to be a consultant because their production had went down in this company, and they could not figure out why their production level had gone down. Well, one of the things that they had ran metrics, they had ran statistics, they still couldn't figure out, why is our production going down? And come to find out, they started talking to some of the employees, and they got some of this anecdotal, personal experience data, And what it was the company had recently changed contractors that cleaned their bathrooms. And the bathrooms were in a sorry state of affairs, and so the employees' production level was down because their mental state had changed because the bathrooms were now dirty. You're thinking, how could something that small cause something that big to happen? Well, that's something you really couldn't get at using the numbers, and they had actually probably used numbers to go with a cheaper contractor, and then nobody had bothered to check up on the contractor to see if the bathrooms were really clean or not. And they weren't. They weren't doing a good job of keeping the bathrooms clean, so that caused that production level to go down. They got rid of that contractor. They got the old one back, and production went back up almost immediately. So that gives you an idea of how you can use qualitative assessment, especially if you don't have the numerical-based assessment. And I really kind of think they go hand in hand. That it's that you can't argue with the numbers, but sometimes you got to be able to get to the numbers. You need to use personal experience, talk to people, get some information as to kind of where to start, so to speak. So all of this leads to risk assessment. On page 10 of your text, make sure you read the general characteristics of a comprehensive risk assessment methodology. I'll go over a couple of those with you really quick. A comprehensive general or comprehensive risk assessment methodology is designed for a specific organization. What works for one company won't necessarily work for another company. You have to design a risk assessment process for each individual corporation that you are providing security for. It also needs to comply with all federal, state, and local regulations. It should be designed for information security, physical security, and a combination of both, or personnel security is one of the buzzwords in the field right now. It should categorize assets based on criticality, and we're going to be talking more about that later. But you need to make a prioritized list of your assets so that you know which ones are the more important to secure first and which ones are on the bottom of the list. You can spend a lot of money and secure a lot of assets, but if you're not securing them based on a priority, you can still be very vulnerable to loss. A risk assessment methodology also identifies existing security measures and how well they're working or not. It also determines threats using multiple sources. Don't rely on one single input piece of information to determine every single threat. You may have to determine what your threat levels are by pulling from this source, pulling from this source, pulling from some other source, and putting all of that together to determine your level of vulnerability. A risk assessment methodology also uses tools and techniques to identify those vulnerabilities. It analyzes risk based upon the vulnerabilities, and it recommends multiple strategies for reducing the risk. You cannot rely on one single strategy to reduce all risk, period. You're going to have to use multiple strategies. It's kind of like if you have a fire in your home and the fire department comes, and the only thing they do is spray water on your fire, it might work. But if they spray water on integral parts of the fire, if they cut electric power, if they cut vent holes in the roof to allow the heat to escape, and they make entry into the residence in order to attack certain parts of the fire so it doesn't spread, as well as to eject the smoke and the heat from the residence, all of those things are multiple strategies to try to help save that structure. If you're only relying on one, it may not work. Another good example, let's go back to the fire. Let's say you have a fire hydrant in front of your home. The fire department rolls up. They have a pumper that carries no water on their pumper. They hook up to the fire hydrant. They turn the hydrant on, and there's no water. Now what? You don't have any water to spray on the fire, so you sit there and roast weenies. Of course not. Every fire department carries water. They have water on the pumper so that if that particular fire hydrant doesn't work, they can at least begin an initial attack. And then they have other trucks that do nothing else but haul water to get water to the fire. Plus they have tools. They have enough manpower to go in, cut vent holes in the roof, to eject the smoke, get the heat out, to attack the fire, to make entrance into the residence, etc. It's an attack on multiple fronts. Security is no different. It is an attack on multiple fronts. You use multiple strategies to try to have an effect on the same vulnerability. Because, yes, it's redundant, but it works. Because if one strategy fails, you've got something else to fall back on. Guys, that's chapter 1 in a nutshell. If you can get your mind wrapped around this, you're not going to have any problems with the rest of this course. This is kind of being a major overview of security risk management in a nutshell. And then we're going to basically break all that apart into its individual pieces the rest of the semester. I probably won't have as long of a lecture each individual time. I'm going to try to keep it to 10 to 15 minutes. I know this one's getting closer to half an hour. But I think it's important that you understand these major, large, big picture concepts to right off the bat to begin with. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email through course messages. And have a good week, and I'll see you in discussions. Bye-bye.